On the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, deep inside a limestone cave buried 400 feet beneath Shuri Castle on Okinawa, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara set down his slide rule and stared across a sweat-darkened map table at the two most powerful men in the Japanese 32nd Army, General Mitsuru Ushijima and his Chief of Staff, the fiery and uncompromising General Isamu Cho. While the air around them clung to their skin like a wet cloth, the humidity near total, the cave walls weeping steadily from condensation shaken loose by the constant thunder of American naval guns battering the ridges above, a sound that never truly stopped and had become the pulse of the battle itself. At 42 years old, Yahara was the Army's operations officer, a quiet, methodical man with wire-rimmed glasses and the bearing of an academic rather than a warrior. Yet for 6 months, he had designed and overseen the construction of the most sophisticated defensive system the Pacific War had ever seen. A system that was working exactly as intended, because for 3 grinding weeks American forces had smashed themselves against his tunnels and reverse slope positions, losing more than 1,000 men each week while making almost no progress toward Shuri, and yet now Ushijima and Cho were demanding that he abandon everything that had kept the army alive and instead gamble everything on a massive counterattack in the open. A demand Yahara knew was madness because he had already run the numbers again and again on his slide rule and understood with mathematical certainty what would happen if they dragged their artillery out of the caves and hurled 2 full divisions across open ground into the teeth of American firepower, and he told them plainly that such an offensive would cost several thousand men in 2 days and accomplish absolutely nothing, only to be met by Cho's furious appeals to honor, samurai spirit, and the necessity of a glorious decisive battle, leaving Yahara alone in that suffocating cavern as the sole voice of mathematics and industrial reality against 2 generals intoxicated by tradition, even though his defensive doctrine had preserved Japanese lives while bleeding the Americans white, turning entire mountains into armor, allowing guns to fire briefly and vanish back into limestone, creating a form of warfare that could drag on for months and make every American advance cost dearly. Yet Ushijima and Cho misread American pressure as weakness rather than the deliberate buildup of overwhelming firepower, and Yahara found himself in the unbearable position of begging his own commanders not to throw away the army he had labored to save, a moment that would prove that sometimes the quiet man with the slide rule understands war better than generals weighted down by medals, and that in the Pacific courage without mathematics was simply another word for suicide. The ideas that might have saved 76,000 Japanese soldiers from annihilation had been planted years earlier, thousands of miles away in the dining halls, factories, and training grounds of the United States during the early 1930s, when Yahara had traveled there as a young exchange officer intended to foster understanding between potential allies, but instead received an education in industrial warfare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Watching American infantry divisions burn more ammunition in a single afternoon of live-fire exercises than most Japanese units saw in half a year, touring factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh that produced tanks and aircraft at rates that seemed almost supernatural to an officer from a nation still reliant on craftsmen hammering rifle bolts by hand, and when he returned to Tokyo, he wrote plainly that Japan could never match American production and must therefore avoid any strategy that depended on outgunning or outproducing the United States, a report that was politely filed and promptly ignored by an imperial army built around the myth of the decisive battle, the belief that a single perfectly timed assault could shatter an enemy's will as it supposedly had against Russia in 1904 and China in 1937, and most officers clung to the conviction that superior spirit could overcome material inferiority and that Americans, softened by comfort and democracy, would crack if struck hard and fast. A belief Yahara knew was fantasy, but one he could not uproot as a mere colonel among generals who had never seen a Ford assembly line or watched American artillery crews service guns with clockwork efficiency. By late 1944, as American forces closed in on the Japanese home islands, Yahara was finally placed where his understanding mattered, assigned to help defend Okinawa, an island only 325 miles from the mainland, whose loss would place American airfields within range of every major Japanese city and provide a staging ground for invasion, an island that could neither be abandoned nor reinforced because American submarines and aircraft dominated the seas, leaving Yahara with roughly 100,000 troops, finite ammunition, and a single realistic objective: hold as long as possible, not to win but to delay. And with that time he implemented a strategy based on a brutal insight that Japanese soldiers were exceptional at dying heroically but inefficient at killing Americans when used according to traditional doctrine, because banzai charges and beach defenses looked dramatic yet typically ended with the annihilation of defenders in days or hours. So Yahara proposed something radical: a war of attrition that traded space for time, withdrew from the beaches to the high ground of southern Okinawa, buried the army deep into limestone ridges where American firepower was blunted, and replaced decisive engagements with 100 small battles that drained American lives yard by yard. The terrain made this possible, as southern Okinawa was a spine of limestone. Ridges 400 to 600 feet high, riddled with natural caves that engineers and conscripted civilians spent 6 months expanding into underground fortresses, creating the Shuri Line anchored on Shuri Castle itself, from which observers could see the northern half of the island and direct fire with lethal precision, while caves dug into reverse slopes remained invisible to naval observers and impervious even to 16-inch shells. Tunnels allowed movement without exposure. Artillery positions were carved with narrow ports that let guns fire and vanish, and machine guns were placed to create overlapping fields of fire that turned every approach into a killing zone, all governed by a single principle: let the Americans climb, then kill them when they crest the ridge and expose themselves. Yahara's artillery doctrine was just as unorthodox, dispersing nearly 300 guns and over 1,000 knee mortars into caves, and ordering them to fire short, precise bursts before going silent, using firepower surgically rather than theatrically. So when Americans finally landed in April with 180,000 troops, massive naval support, 3,000 aircraft, and limitless logistics, they found not a suicidal defense on the beaches but 76,000 Japanese troops waiting in stone. And when the Americans launched their so-called all-out assault on April 19th, after the largest preparatory bombardment of the Pacific War, obliterating the ridges with thousands of tons of explosives, they advanced convinced nothing could have survived, only to be cut down by machine gun and artillery fire from caves untouched by the barrage, losing 700 men in a day, 22 tanks destroyed, and gaining nothing, proof that Yahara's system worked exactly as designed. Week after week inflicting over 1,000 casualties on divisions like the 96th and 7th while remaining largely intact, because American firepower pulverized empty rock while Japanese soldiers waited safely behind hundreds of feet of limestone, emerging only when American infantry silhouetted themselves on the skyline, where Type 92 machine guns, knee mortars, and concealed howitzers slaughtered them before disappearing again. Yet this success bred danger, because some Japanese commanders misread American losses as weakness, particularly Cho, who saw reports of overflowing hospitals and replacement requests as evidence that one bold counterattack could break American morale, and Yahara watched in dread as victory in defense created pressure for offense, knowing that the moment troops left their caves the arithmetic of attrition would reverse, and the fatal decision was born in the Shuri Command Cave on April 29th amid sweat, smoke, and maps, where Cho unveiled an ambitious plan committing nearly every unit to a coordinated offensive supported by amphibious raids and, worst of all, requiring more than 200 artillery pieces to emerge from concealment into open firing positions, instantly negating the entire defensive system. Yahara argued relentlessly, showing with cold numbers that the offensive would cost thousands of lives in days and annihilate the 32nd Army, while Cho countered with honor, tradition, and Gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel, and the debate revealed the fundamental schism between realism and spiritual idealism, between war as arithmetic and war as ritual, until on April 30th Ushijima announced the offensive would proceed, rejecting Yahara's final private plea and ordering him to plan it, and Yahara saluted, knowing he was now engineering the destruction of the army he had tried to save. Before dawn on May 4th the artillery emerged from their caves, guns that had been nearly invulnerable now sitting exposed on terraces and ridgelines, firing the heaviest barrage the Army would unleash in the entire battle. 13,000 rounds announcing every position to American radar, observers, and spotter planes, and the American response was immediate and devastating as counter-battery fire and naval guns methodically destroyed exposed batteries, while infantry attacks across open ground were shredded by pre-registered artillery. Amphibious raids were annihilated by radar-directed naval gunfire before reaching shore, and within 2 days more than 6,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. 59 artillery pieces destroyed. Entire battalions erased, exactly as Yahara had predicted, leaving caves filled with wounded who could not be evacuated and weapons that could not be replaced. And after the disaster, silence settled over the shattered army as radios carried only reports of shortages and reorganizations, while Yahara returned to defensive doctrine, commanding remnants instead of divisions. And when Buckner resumed his offensive on May 11th, the difference was stark as weakened Japanese resistance collapsed, Sugarloaf and Conical Hill fell, and the Shuri Line was breached, making withdrawal inevitable. The final act came in June when Ushijima and Cho chose suicide over surrender, ordering Yahara to live so that someone would know the truth, a command more cruel than death, forcing him to survive with the knowledge that thousands had died not from lack of courage but from decisions that ignored reality. And when American forces captured him on June 23, he became the highest-ranking Japanese officer to survive Okinawa, his testimony and later memoirs preserving a stark lesson of industrial warfare, that the final tally of nearly 94,000 Japanese dead against 48,000 American casualties validated every calculation he had made, and that the 2-day offensive meant to restore honor had only proven that courage without proper application was suicide in the age of modern war.